Tim, as a player, we never knew the extent about some biases, but we kind of felt it at times. Now, I mean, go back to high school. You got players all the time that say, "Oh, ref, you're cheating." What are you doing? This was in high school, this was in college, and of course, this was in the league. And I played in that era. Were there discussions among refs in the locker room before a game, like, we got to give Shaq the benefit of the doubt, or keep an eye on Rashid, or we got to stick it to Allen Iverson? Is this, were those things relevant in the locker room with the officials?
Jimmy, more than you could ever imagine.
Really?
I know you had a good personality back in the day. You were one of those guys that always had the smile, was likable. But, there were people that, like Rashid, that, referees couldn't stand. We used to bet, $20 or $50 in the locker room to see who would give him the first technical foul. So there are always situations where somebody would say, I'm going to help this guy. The last time I had him, I had a couple fouls on him I shouldn't have after looking at the tape. So I got to, take care of him tonight. Always relationships that were positive or negative between referees and coaches, referees and players, and referees and even owners that spilled out onto the floor. And I used that information, unfortunately, to profit. And if a line was 4 or 5 points, these relationships would maybe make it, in my mind, 8 or 9 or 10 points. And, it was a situation where, yes, no secret that, Joe Crawford didn't like, Cuban. He didn't like Tim Duncan. There were situations with Javi and Allen Iverson. And, those things, when we discussed it, spilled out onto the floor. And in a situation with Iverson and Javi, he threatened him one night. The NBA fined Iverson $20,000.
Who threatened who?
What's that?
Who threatened who?
Allen Iverson threatened Javi in a game. Javi ended up giving him a technical foul, throwing him out, and then it was reported, and the league fined out Iverson $20,000. We felt that, he should have been suspended. So I had him in one of the next games, and we were in the locker room, said, we're going to stick it to him. Let's call palming violations on him tonight. He palms the ball every night. Nobody ever calls it. Let's just enforce it tonight. We all went out. We all took turns calling a palming violation on him. When he goes to the basket, he was getting hit, and we weren't calling it. And right near the end of the game, he comes up to me, real nonchalant. He said, "Hey, Tim, how long is this going to go on for?" And I looked him right in the eye, and I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And he laughed. He goes, "You know what I'm talking about." And he just kind of shook his head and walked away from me. So, it was a situation where this was discussed a lot. Personalities with referees and players conflicting had a lot to do with how the whistle was blown out on the floor.
That's interesting, too, because we always talk about the purity of the game and playing, but officials are human like anybody else. Again, and officials carry grudges like anybody else. We've seen that. Who is it that they always talk about? Chris Paul, and that he hasn't won a game. Yeah, Scott Foster.
That's Foster, right.
That thing has been, people can discount it, but it is something there where every time Scott officials a game or referees a game, something for Chris Paul doesn't go right. But it's one of those things where as a player, you say it, but you don't want to believe it. But it's something inside of you kind of know that this official just has it out for me. And you control a lot of that, what happens to me as a player. Now, the difference between your case and maybe what they're talking about with Terry Rozier, and you pointed this out, you didn't influence the score or anything like that. You didn't manipulate the game in order to have a outcome for whoever was benefiting from it. So you may have had what you're saying is you may have had a dislike for a player and may not have called a call or put him in foul trouble, but that didn't lead to what you were doing from the inside information perspective, correct?
Right, but here's the thing with the NBA, and you know this, it's so subjective for, block charges, rule enforcement, and it's really enforced based on the name sometimes on the front and the back of the jerseys, rather than how the violations take place on the floor. And you as a player and a good player, I'm sure you walked out onto the floor, and the first thing you do is you look to see who's officiating.
Yes.
If you have a good relationship with that official, if you feel you get a good whistle from him, or if you feel like you don't. And that happened, all the time, when it came to officials and players. And, it's something that really has to be taken out of the game. These rules have to be enforced based on the rules that are written in the rule book, not based on the names on the front and the back of the jerseys. And we even see last night, I don't know if you saw this highlight, but the guy from Milwaukee, the star player,
Giannis,
he took 6 or 7 steps with the ball last night. And Reggie Miller flat out said, he said, hey, listen, if I was able to do this back in the day, I would have played till I was 50. And he laughed. But, it's the truth. Certain players are allowed to do certain things and certain players aren't.
check out new episodes of The Jim Jackson Show every Thursday. Watch on the Rich Eisen Show YouTube page. Follow the show on Instagram @Jim Jackson Show, or listen wherever you get your podcasts.